What's up guys, Brad here. Now with the Xbox Series X and PS5 right around the corner, this question has been coming up a lot. Should you upgrade your display for the next generation of consoles? Well, let's dig in and find out. Now before we dive into all the good stuff, if you're new here, I post home theater and gaming related content. So if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so as I post new content every single week. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel for free, please consider using my Amazon affiliate links in the description below. Now let's get down to it. So the Xbox Series X and PS5 are almost here, and if you were lucky enough to snag a pre-order, I was not, then you have some fun times coming up. But you may be asking yourself if you need to upgrade your TV in order to take full advantage of these next generation consoles, including HDMI 2.1. I mean, Black Friday is also right around the corner, so we should be seeing some decent deals on TVs coming up. So upgrading might be on your mind right now anyway. So let's break it down, go over what we know and don't know about the next gen consoles, and figure out if buying a TV for the next generation consoles makes sense, or if it would actually even be worth it. First off, let's look at the facts and what we know about these consoles from a hardware standpoint. No, I'm not talking about graphical horsepower or which one's more powerful than the other here. No, I'm actually referring to what types of hardware outputs do they have and what do they support. Well, both consoles have HDMI 2.1 ports. Well, what does that even mean? Well, that means that you'll have support for resolutions up to 4K at 120 frames per second, and 8K at 60 frames per second, including HDR. Notice I said up to. That's definitely something you want to pay attention to when looking at marketing materials and stuff like that. Just because they support it doesn't mean that every game will be 4K at 120 frames per second or 8K at 60 frames per second, and some games might not even have HDR. Think about this. An NVIDIA RTX 3090, a $1,500 graphics card, cannot even maintain 8K at 60 frames per second with the majority of titles that were tested with it, unless they were using NVIDIA's DLSS AI upscaling, which basically renders the game at a lower resolution and then uses an AI algorithm to upscale it. Native 8K gaming, it's completely off the table. And then you throw ray tracing into the mix and it just becomes impossible. Now, if a $1,500 graphics card cannot achieve that, then a $500 gaming console that's coming out soon will definitely not be able to achieve that. So what does this have to do with buying a new TV for the next gen consoles? Well, if you buy a new TV under the assumption that the next gen consoles will be putting out games at 4K at 120 frames per second as the new standard, and believe me, there are people out there that think that, I'm sure, then you are setting yourself up for a huge disappointment. I think 4K at 60 frames per second is far more likely considering the power of each console. And honestly, we might not be seeing a whole lot of native 4K games at 60 frames per second, but instead games utilizing AI upscaling to achieve those higher frame rates and higher resolutions. My point here is this: if most next-gen games are 4K at 60 frames per second with HDR, then you actually don't need HDMI 2.1. You can get that on HDMI 2.0 right now. You can get that on an Xbox One X. Heck, you can even get the Xbox One X to output 1440p at 120 frames per second if your TV supports it, but you won't get HDR. And that's not because HDMI 2.0, that's actually because Microsoft locks HDR to 4K resolution. It could do it if Microsoft allowed it. So that means you're good to go with your current TV as long as it accepts 4K at 60 frames per second and HDR, right? Well, maybe, but it's not quite that simple. You see, HDMI 2.1 also has more in the feature set than just higher resolutions and refresh rates. It also has variable refresh rate, or VRR, which basically syncs your TV's panel refresh rate to the frame rate being sent over the HDMI cable from the console, which eliminates motion judder and smooths things out. Now, VRR is also supported on HDMI 2.0 with certain displays, but you're obviously capped out at 4K and 60 frames per second. Auto Low Latency Mode, or ALLM, is another touted benefit of HDMI 2.1, and just like VRR, is also available on select HDMI 2.0 TVs as well. All this really does is sends a signal to your TV telling it to switch over to game mode or whatever low latency mode is called on your TV. Now this is just more of a convenience feature than anything else. If you don't mind switching on game mode yourself, or if you have custom picture settings set up like I do, then this really won't matter too much. And then there's eARC, which is basically an upgraded version of ARC, or Audio Return Channel. Now, the current implementation of ARC is spotty at best. It doesn't allow for high-resolution, lossless audio tracks, such as Dolby Atmos and DTS:X, to be sent to the receiver from your TV. Now, eARC is a pretty big deal if you prefer to plug your consoles directly into the HDMI port on your TV and not use your receiver or AVR for switching, or maybe you have a soundbar that has limited inputs. With eARC, you no longer have to sacrifice audio quality when using it, which is a massive, massive benefit. But that brings me to my final point. If you're using a home theater receiver or soundbar with HDMI 2.0 and you go out and buy a brand new TV with HDMI 2.1, you're going to have to upgrade those devices to an HDMI 2.1 compatible soundbar or receiver to get any of the benefits and features of HDMI 2.1. That's right, you're not done just spending thousands upon thousands of dollars on a new TV. You now basically have to replace anything in the chain that is between your TV and your new console. And since neither of the new consoles have optical audio outputs, getting those HDMI 2.1 features are extremely difficult, if not impossible, without upgrading your soundbar or receiver. So what's the final verdict? Should you rush out and buy a brand new TV with HDMI 2.1 right now? Do you even need it for next-gen consoles? Well, honestly, if you enjoy the current TV you have and it can do 4K, HDR, and 60 frames per second, then my personal recommendation is just to hold off for a little while if you can. We simply don't know if and when games on consoles are going to exceed 4K at 60 frames per second, and if I'm being completely honest, it's going to be quite a while before they do. Now, HDMI 2.1 benefits like variable refresh rate are certainly nice to have for games that have wildly varying frame rates, but unless a game has an unlocked frame rate option, then you may not see much of a benefit using VRR like you would if you were gaming on a PC. Now, what if you're in the market for a new TV? Well, that's a completely different ballgame, and at that point, I would definitely consider looking at an HDMI 2.1 set. Now, granted, remember, you may have to upgrade your current receiver or soundbar to one that supports HDMI 2.1 if the one you have doesn't already. Otherwise, you're not going to get any of those HDMI 2.1 features. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up. It lets me know that you appreciate this type of content. Also, if you have any questions about HDMI 2.1, next-gen consoles, or anything home theater and gaming related, please leave me a comment below. Who knows, it could spark an idea for a future video. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one where I accidentally break my arm and then my tendon heals a little tight.
Funky butt loving.